Welcome everyone to the Center of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies seminar series. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge the Bindal and Wolgurukupa peoples as the traditional owners of the lands and waters where we live and work, and honor their elders past, present, and emerging. So I'll now pass it over to Jamie to introduce our speaker today.
Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Rachel Dacks as our seminar speaker. Rachel's research program focuses on the human dimensions of resource management. One of the things I think is really wonderful about Rachel's work is that she has this.
I think she may have been cut off, but I'm sure she would have said something really great, Rachel. So maybe I'll just read your biography. So Rachel is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Hawaii. She focuses on using qualitative and quantitative methods to better understand complex human dimensions of natural resource management. She started out her early academic career working on marine ecology and fisheries, but then had a life-changing experience as a Peace Corps volunteer in Fiji, and that made her aware of the need to include socio-cultural factors in conservation research management. So she shifted her research focus, and her PhD used mixed effects to understand drivers of social ecological resilience across 20 coastal villages in Fiji. She's currently working on a project focused on geospatial and social mapping and assessment of environmental stewardship activities and works in Hawaii. I think what she'll mostly be talking about today is things she did in her PhD research, but I'm sure she would be happy to answer any questions about her current research as well. So Rachel, please take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Am I all set with screens and can everyone hear me? Is that okay?
Everything's good here. Yep.
Great. Okay. Well, aloha mai kako from Maunalani Heights in Honolulu on the island of Oahu. Before I begin, I just wanted to thank the seminar organizers for inviting me to speak today, and also to those of you who have tuned in. As Ian mentioned, I am currently a postdoc at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I am going to speak about part of my dissertation work that occurred several years ago, but was published last year, I guess. And this work took place in Fiji, but also happy to answer any questions for anyone who has any questions about my current work. And also want to mention that I'm not going to be able to get to all the details of this study, so please, happy to answer any questions at the end. Yeah, okay. So as many of you who are tuning in today probably are well versed in, coral reef ecosystems together with human communities are part of larger social ecological systems, and these systems are inextricably linked. Reefs provide several ecosystems, goods and services such as food and shoreline protection. They also provide resources that support cultural practices. Humans impact reefs through things like fishing, land activities, production of greenhouse gases. And as such, the state of the reef influences and is influenced by the human community. And this works vice versa, right? Human communities shape and are shaped by coral reefs. And so it's important to know in this figure that these diagrams go in both directions, and that the processes that are represented by these arrows may change depending on the state of the ecological or human communities. And we've seen in examples across the world, not just in coral reef systems, that resource management, the chances of resource management being successful is greatly increased when these links are well understood and incorporated into planning and management interventions. That may be easier said than done, though, because these links are quite complicated. And so in the last decade or two, coral reef management has really focused on managing for resilience. And there's been amazing progress made in understanding the ecological interactions that drive coral reef resilience, ecological resilience in particular. But we can't tell corals, algae, and fish what to do. We might, however, be able to manage water quality, connectivity, and thermal stress. But to do so, we really need to understand anthropogenic factors like human-induced climate change, development, land use, and fishing, among other things. And so in this diagram right here, right now, before I move on, I just want to acknowledge that this is a super complex system, right? And we're not even representing all the factors and mechanisms and dynamics that exist. But even though this system looks really complex, I would argue that we are still missing another layer. And that layer is sociocultural factors, which if we really want to manage people, we need to understand the sociocultural factors that influence behaviors, such as fishing. And so this whole layer that's missing, there's no reason to believe that this layer is any less complex or less complicated than the existing layers underneath it. And so I've put a couple of those sociocultural factors up as examples. These are associated with individuals and societies. And you can imagine the mess of arrows that would be going on here if we tried to represent all the mechanisms about how the sociocultural factors are linked to the underlying layers. Eleanor Ostrom and others have given us some frameworks to understand the ways that resources, ecosystems, individuals, and societies are connected. There are also many great, rich, descriptive studies about how these sociocultural factors are linked to behaviors. But it's only been in the last couple of years that there have been some studies that have started to study in quantitative ways how these sociocultural factors are drivers of behaviors such as fishing. Oops. And so I actually use this diagram fairly frequently in the introduction of my talks, but it really wasn't until preparing for this talk that I realized that this diagram also kind of represents my journey to where I am in my professional life right now. And Ian said that sometimes speakers kind of talk about their journeys a bit. So I just wanted to give you a background. So my start in coral reef systems really was as a student studying ecology. So I also started kind of in the center here. I moved into fisheries. I was a fisheries observer for a while and worked in other ways with fishers. But it really wasn't until I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Fiji on a tiny island in a tiny village that I really came to understand the significance of this purple sociocultural ring and how it links to other factors and these other various layers, and really how important it is to understand these in order to develop culturally appropriate management that's going to be effective. Okay, so my diagram in the past couple slides, really my point is that even if we know all the dynamics and every single way that the ecology works and what interacts with what in that center green sphere, planning for biological success does not always lead to success. So even if we have perfect ecological understanding and data, if it's not leading to happy, healthy, successful people, we can't guarantee that interventions are going to work. So we need to know more about the social system. And so because planning for because biological success doesn't always equal social success, it's important that reefs are managed not just for ecological resilience, but for social ecological resilience, or the ability of a social ecological system to resist, recover, and adapt from disturbance while maintaining structure, function, and feedbacks. And the feedbacks that this definition is referring to could be those in the diagram that I showed at the beginning of this talk between coral reefs and human communities. And so if we look to see the factors that are important for social or socio-ecological resilience, something that pops up in the literature quite frequently is the importance of social networks. And there have been several authors that have written extensively about how important networks are for enabling coping and recovery after disturbances. And what I mean here, for example, is if a large hurricane or cyclone comes through and floods your farm or plantation, you're going to activate the links in your social network in order to access food or planting materials or cash while you cope and recover. I want to also point out that these sharing networks are important for coping and recovery, not just for natural disturbances like natural disasters, but also for social disturbances, including the one we're in right now. So the pandemic has had some pretty large economic impacts on the economies of places all over the world, but in particular in the Pacific Islands, where tourism may be a large part of the economy. There are huge economic impacts. And some of these Pacific Islands have also recently experienced some pretty strong cyclones. So they're experiencing this kind of double whammy of disturbances. And social networks have been really important for recovering and coping. But it's not just in the literature that we see that social networks are important for resilience. So myself and colleagues have led several workshops across the region in which we've asked participants what makes their communities resilient. And by and large, we've heard many responses that can be categorized under this header of connections to people and place. However, I've been involved in some other work that shows that these connections aren't commonly measured or monitored in resilience or well-being or health frameworks for a couple different reasons. People say that they're intangible and may not be able to be measured. I disagree, or that they're hard to measure, or that people don't always acknowledge that they are important for resilience. And when participants spoke about their connections to people and place, they often did so in terms of reciprocity. So I just wanted to explain that before we go any further. So when I say reciprocity, I'm referring to mutual exchange. And exchange can be between people, it can be between people and nature. For the purposes of this talk, I'm talking about exchange between people. In the Pacific Islands, it's generalized reciprocity, which is common, which means that if somebody shares or gifts something, there's not an expectation for something of equal value to be returned. And there's not an expectation of an immediate gift in return. So days, weeks, months, even generations could go by before a gift is returned. And that's done on purpose in many cases because people want to maintain these deficits so that when they do need something, they can call on these links that they're owed something perhaps. And network connections are secured and maintained through reciprocity. So sharing networks are basically these bounded collection of connections that are created through reciprocity. And although sharing through social networks is highly important to many communities, there's not a lot of quantitative studies that have documented. There's, like I mentioned before, rich ethnographies and descriptive studies exist. But in the Pacific, quantitative studies are existing. When studies do exist, the sharing is usually about sharing of knowledge or information. Very few studies exist for resource sharing. And I think there are many reasons why quantifying these networks is important. One of them, I think, is for developing culturally appropriate natural resource management. So in systems, ecosystems such as coral reefs, I think coral reef resources are often accounted for as being food or income, but benefits beyond that aren't necessarily considered. And by not considering them, you risk inappropriate management that may not be followed. In addition, in our changing world, there's really a need for studies that examine how changing socioeconomic conditions like urbanization, monetization of resources, and changing global environmental conditions, which may affect resources that are shared in networks, how these are going to affect networks in order to plan to manage for social-ecological resilience. And so the work that I'm going to present today really focuses on these three questions. So the first one, what is the role of marine resources in sharing networks? Two, how do socioeconomic conditions impact sharing networks? And then the third one is, are there specific fishing gear types that are more associated with sharing of fish catch? And in my work, I try to take as much as possible a biocultural approach. A biocultural approach is the knowledge that human practices, knowledge and beliefs influence and are influenced by the landscapes and seascapes of which humans are a part. These approaches build on world views and values of the local community and really focus on the feedbacks and relationships between people and place. So specifically for this study, I conducted social network analyses in 18 villages in Fiji across a socioeconomic gradient. I'll show you them in the next slide. And to do this analysis, I and a group and a team conducted network surveys in at least 80% of the household in each of those 18 villages. So a total of 374 surveys. And so here is Fiji. The districts that I worked in are in black. You'll notice that 2 of these districts are in this largest island of Viti Levu. This is also the island where the capital city of Suva is located. Suva is also the name of one of the districts on this island. And then the other 2 districts that I worked in are on these outer islands. And then the numbers in the parentheses are the number of villages within each district that I worked in. And if you're not familiar with social networks, specifically gathering social network data, people who aren't are sometimes surprised by how few questions you need in order to gather a lot of data. And so in the social network part of the survey, there were really only 2 questions. So the first question was, in the past 2 weeks, with whom in the village have you shared resources? And then on the flip side, in the past 2 weeks, who in the village has shared resources with you? And for each of these questions, the respondent shared the households where the resources came from or went to, and then also specified what resources were shared. And I just want to point out to you that we bound it to in the village. So these are intra-village sharing networks, even though resources are shared in networks beyond the village also. And so from those 2 questions, I was able to gather enough data to put together a network for each village. So in each of these squares is a social network for each village. And if you're not familiar with social networks, I'm just gonna, in the next couple slides, I'm gonna walk you through some of the basics and metrics. So in social network maps or sociograms, the points are nodes. In this case, these points are individual households. And then the links, the lines between the nodes, indicate sharing or giving or receiving of a resource, in this case, any resource. And so I calculated several different metrics from or in each of these networks in order to be able to characterize the networks so we could compare across them. The first metric I calculated was reciprocity, and a tie is said to be reciprocated if there are arrows going in both directions. So in terms of my networks, if a house both gives and receives from another household. Here is an example of one village's network. And in this case, reciprocity is 0.62. So that means that 62% of the dyads or pairs of households both give and receive from each other. And if we look across all the networks, we see that the mean reciprocity is about half. And that makes sense to me. I was definitely expecting it to be less than 1 because we don't expect there to be perfect sharing in both directions for each dyad. As I mentioned earlier, in the Pacific, it's generalized reciprocity, that's common. So we only asked about the past 2 weeks, right? But weeks, months, generations could go by before something was gifted in exchange. In addition, we only asked about material goods. And just because a resource is shared doesn't mean that a resource is going to be shared in return. So time, labor, childcare, knowledge could be the exchange, and we did not capture those. So 0.54 is pretty close to other studies who have calculated reciprocity in sharing networks. And again, I wasn't expecting it to be anywhere close to 1. So next, I'm going to describe 2 measures of cohesion, which I calculated. The first one is degree centrality. And so I'm talking about cohesion. It's that term. It means what you think it means. It's not specific to social networks. It just means how close-knit or connected a network is. And centrality, I'm going to show you how it's calculated. So imagine this is a village of 4 households, and these lines between them indicate giving or receiving resources. And we can measure degree centrality for each house. And we do that by counting the number of ties that comes out of each node or each household. And I have labeled each household with its degree centrality. And to get a network level measure of cohesion, we can take the average degree centrality from the whole village. And in this case, the average is 2. And for degree centrality, the higher the number, the more cohesive, the more connected the network is. The other measure of cohesion I calculated was average distance. And this is not a distance based on physical location, but it's a distance based on the number of ties between 2 nodes. So geodesic distance can be calculated for each pair of nodes. I'm going to do another example here. So here's our 4 household village. And because there's a tie between household A and household B, that's the shortest distance between them. So that distance is 1. But if we wanted to calculate the distance between C and D, there's no connection between those 2. And the shortest distance is through B. So the distance between C and D is 2. And so if we take the average, if we calculate the distance between every possible set of households and we take the average for this example network, it's 1.3. And unlike centrality, which I described before distance, the larger the number for distance, the less connected, the less cohesive the network is, right? Because it means you have to travel more to get between 2 nodes. So next I calculated composition of ties. And so the network maps I've been showing you, these gray ones, are actually multiplex networks because they represent several different types of ties. And so when people told us about resources they were sharing or that they were being shared with them, they mentioned resources that could be categorized as marine resources, so marine resources, which were mostly fish, but some inverts too, terrestrial resources, which were mostly crops, prepared food, which could be made up of the top other 2 terrestrial and marine resources, and then cash and purchased goods. So once I separated out all these kinds of ties, I could assess the composition of the network or the proportion of ties coming from each of these types of resources. And so in this example, again, this is 1 village, 37% of ties were from terrestrial resources, 42 from marine resources, and so on. If we look across all the villages, these are the averages of the composition of ties across all the networks. So terrestrial resources, marine resources, and prepared foods were all around 30%, although there was quite a bit of variation. Oops. And then cash and purchased goods average was 15%. And so the next thing I did was to plot the villages in multidimensional space using MMDS plots. And I plotted each village using their cohesion metrics, so both distance and centrality, and then the proportions of the types of resources shared, so marine ties, terrestrial or land ties, and then cash or purchase ties. And so in this figure, each point represents a village, and then the color of the point corresponds to the district in which the village is located. And in these NMDS plot, in the NMDS plot, we saw two clusters that stood out. So the cluster on the right is made up exclusively of the villages on that largest main island where the capital city is located. And these villages are associated with higher proportions of cash and purchase good ties in their networks, and networks with larger distances or less connected networks. The cluster on the left is made up of villages on the other two outer islands. These villages are associated with higher proportions of marine and terrestrial resource ties in their networks and higher average degree centrality or more connected networks. And then the next thing I did was to overlay village level averages of different household characteristics on the plot. And so here you see that household fishing frequency, seafood consumption, material wealth, and town visits. These four characteristics all significantly correlate with the ordination, and that's why they're on here. Based on the lengths of the arrows, you can see that household fishing frequency had the strongest correlation with the ordination. And you can also see that average household fishing frequency and seafood consumption are correlated with the proportion of marine ties, and then average degree centrality or more connected villages, whereas the material wealth and town visits are correlated with increasing network distance, which is a characteristic of less connected villages. And this is really an exploratory way of looking at some of these relationships. I did some simple regressions that confirmed these correlations, but more complex models can definitely further investigate these relationships. Okay, so moving on now from the social network analysis. In the household surveys, so a subset of the households that I did social network surveys, I also did pretty extensive household survey, which asked about fishing and farming and traditional knowledge and livelihoods and all sorts of things. Part of that survey, we asked about fishing, fishing frequency, different types of gears, and then for each gear type used, we asked respondents to estimate the proportion of their catch, which stays at home for household consumption, what proportion is sold, and then what proportion is shared with others outside of the house. And so with that data and with some catch per unit effort estimates, I was able to estimate the annual household catch that's shared from the different gear types. So gear type is on the x-axis, the biomass or the kilograms of annual household catch is on the y-axis, and this is household catch specifically used for sharing. And in this graph, in this figure, you can see that night spearfishing and gillnet fishing had the largest catches used for sharing. And this makes sense to me. This wasn't unexpected because these are the highest efficiency gear types. So these are gears that are associated with largest catch. If you have more catch, you have more surplus, which you can share. Also, in thinking about gillnets are pretty expensive and not everyone owns one. So people borrow them a lot. So if you're borrowing from another household, you're going to share some of your catch probably with that household. Similarly, in Fiji at least, gillnets are usually used with boats. Not everyone has a boat. If you borrow someone's boat, you're probably going to share some of your catch with them. Also, gillnets are huge. I don't know if you, I didn't show that picture yet. They're pretty huge. They take multiple people to operate. So if you're working with people from another household, you're probably going to share some catch with them. So this wasn't very surprising. However, gillnets and night spearfishing aren't regarded as very environmentally friendly fishing practices and are pretty unsustainable in many cases. And as such, they may be very attractive to ban. So a manager may say, oh, these are causing, big problems, overfishing, and so forth. Why don't we just ban them? However, I would argue that if you ban gillnets and night spearfishing, you may be impacting sharing networks. Or if people value the benefits of sharing over the consequences of being caught not following the regulation, they're not going to comply with these bans. So we've come up with some alternatives to banning these practices. Instead of banning gillnets and spearfishing, I think you could simply put restrictions on them. So for example, with gillnets, you could restrict the mesh size to make a bigger mesh size so the smaller fish can get out. You can restrict soak time. You can require attendance at the net so it doesn't get lost and snag a whole bunch of stuff. Similarly, instead of banning night spearfishing, you could restrict spearfishing by species, because night spearfishing is highly selective. You know what fish you're catching. You could also restrict to certain sizes. At the time of my surveys, scuba spearfishing wasn't very common, but I think restricting or banning scuba for spearfishing could prevent that becoming a worse problem. My co-authors and I on this paper also really recommend using lunar calendars, perhaps together with reproductive or fecundity studies to guide best harvest practices. And then finally, another recommendation is periodic harvested closures. So in Fiji and elsewhere in Melanesia, many outside non-governmental organizations work with communities and enact these marine protected areas. Oftentimes thinking is, oh, these are part of your culture. You guys have been using tambu or rahui or kapu areas for centuries. It should work well. But there's often a mismatch between understanding of the community and understanding of these conservation organizations, because in the past, these closures, tambu areas, kapu areas, what have you, haven't been permanent. So, and they haven't been for the conservation of biodiversity, right? In the past, closures were temporary and opened oftentimes for social gatherings or different life events. And recent studies, including Carvalho et al., have actually done some modeling to show that periodic harvested closures can work if the time between openings is long enough, and when the closure does open, it's not harvested completely to death. So I think PHC's, periodic harvested closures, would be a strong recommendation and a great alternative to bans of these two methods. Okay, so in summary, this study has shown that marine resources are commonly shared in social networks. Both the network structure and composition differed between these main island villages and the outer island villages. So the structure meaning the villages on the main island were less cohesive or less connected, whereas the ones on the outer islands were more strongly connected, or more connected, I should say. And then the composition differed, right? The villages on the main island had more ties from sharing of money or purchased resources, whereas the other outer island villages had more resource sharing. We also showed that household fishing frequency correlates with some of the network measures. So where villages that had a higher fishing frequency had more connected networks. And then gillnets and night spearfishing are the fishing methods most associated with sharing. And so what does this mean for the future? Well, as villages become more connected to markets, as resources become more monetized, we may see some change to these sharing networks that may resemble the networks on the main island. And knowing this, I think we can plan ways to maintain social ecological resilience. But I want to point out too that just because intra-village sharing network connectedness, just because it goes down doesn't necessarily mean that resilience also lowers. People may be sharing more outside of the village, so people may have more bridging ties to other villages, which may be beneficial if, especially in natural disturbances where there's kind of a heterogeneous impact, such as the cyclone, right? Some villages are more impacted than others. So having stronger out ties may be more beneficial than intra-village ties. Or another way this could work is that as households, or if households diversify their livelihoods more, they may have less surplus. For example, if the household starts farming and having other income sources and not just relying on fishing, they may have less of a surplus to share, but they kind of have diversified their portfolio a little, so that may actually help increase resilience. And then finally, sharing networks will have to adapt to maintain cohesion if fish stocks decline, which is the prediction. However, I think these sharing networks are highly adaptive, and there are several examples from across the Pacific of other places where non-reef fish species are being shared, such as some nearshore pelagics or even some further shore pelagics like tuna. Okay, and then as I mentioned, this study really only focused on intra-village sharing. I think it would be really interesting and important to also further study inter-village sharing. And I did a little bit of that in some focus groups, but really just scratched the surface. I asked people in villages kind of like what their villages have been known for sharing with other villages. And we heard lots and lots of different resources from different villages. Some that were more inland were known for more freshwater stream resources. Ones on the coast had specific clams or specific fish species that they were known for, that in the past, that's really what they've shared. But a lot of the villages said, oh, we still have those connections to the other villages. We still share with them, but many of those connections are from sharing now of purchased goods and cash resources. I think also further studies on transnational sharing dynamics are super important. If I'm probably in Australia too, when you fly into the airport there, or for sure when you fly into the airports of other Pacific islands, you'll see these large coolers on the belts with the luggage. These coolers are often full of fish or empty because they've unloaded their fish on one of the other islands. And I've done a little bit of work on this in Palau and have seen that this biomass can be quite large. So I think it's important to understand how much fish is going overseas as part of these sharing networks, and also important to understand the benefits that come back in those sharing networks that may take a whole lot of different forms. And then finally, I didn't study anything beyond if people said they shared fish or clams or other inverts. I didn't ask any questions beyond that, but I think it'd be really interesting to have a better understanding of species that are shared in these networks, as well as even the size that are being shared, because I think that could help guide management also. And so with that, I'd like to acknowledge all the people that were involved in this study, my co-authors and the funders of this research. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and take any questions if there's time.